Okay, so now we're going to wrap up Module 5, and we're going to talk about machine learning applications and seismic analysis. As most of you probably know, this is one of my main fields of research and one of my favorite topics, but I'm not going to get too carried away. I'm going to try to keep it to 20 minutes and not turn this into a semester-long course yet. Okay, so what we're going to cover really quickly is we're going to start with projection techniques, and then I'll move a little bit into unsupervised clustering with methods like self-organizing maps and generative topographic maps. And then I'm going to very, very briefly touch on supervised classification and explainable AI. And so none of these I'm going to go very deep in this lecture. I'm just going to kind of talk about ways we use them and what we can get from them. But you could always, of course, reach out to me if you want to learn a little bit more. We've got tons of information up on our ASPE website for that. Okay, so one of the fundamental problems we have when we do seismic analysis and then multi-attribute seismic analysis is that we end up working essentially in multiple dimensions. And so it's really easy to see in this case where I'm showing us taking the seismic amplitude data and then we're doing a continuous wavelet transform on the data. And we end up, maybe we're doing it every 5 hertz or so throughout the bandwidth of the seismic data. And so we end up with a 5 hertz magnitude spectral component. We end up with a 5 hertz phase component and a 10 hertz and a 15 and a 20 and a 30 and a 40 and a 50, and same thing for the spectral voice components. So we end up with, dozens of different 3D, essentially seismic cubes. And so what we want to be able to do is get the information we need out of all of these different attributes or frequencies without making it too complex. And so that's where we go into dimension reduction. And so there's a couple of things I want to cover first. So whenever we start jumping into machine learning or dimension reductions, we always want to talk about data preparation. And so you can look at these kind of 2 examples here. In one case, we have properly scaled data, and in the other case, we have clipped data. Okay, whether we're looking at it as a wavelet or we're looking at it as, with the color bar. And so you always want to make sure that you never clip your data. You always want to work with 32-bit floating data if you have it as your input data, if possible. And so that way you don't end up with like these high frequency anomalies like I'm pointing out on the right-hand side with the white arrows, because those will end up being artifacts in your interpretation and your, dimension reduction machine learning outputs. So be careful about clipped data. Okay, so the first technique I want to talk about is principal component analysis, or PCA. And so you could think about this as finding the main directions of variation in your data. And so what you want to do is you end up projecting the data along eigenvectors. And the first eigenvector is the one that kind of has the best fit through your cloud of multidimensional data points in multidimensional space. And so the first eigenvector captures the most variance in your data. And so that's the one we tend to work with first. One thing I do need to mention is that PCA data is not good with cyclical data. So you can think about directions. Northeast, southwest, we often go from 0 to 360 around in a circle. That's cyclical data. Phase data is also sometimes cyclical. And so you want to be very careful about those, because PCA and a lot of other machine learning methods don't know that 0 and 360 is actually the same thing. So they can be very sensitive and cause artifacts. All right, so in PCA data, when we spread out, like here we're just doing it in 2 dimensions with 2 different attributes. We get our first principal component in this direction, and then the second principal component. And so that first principal component is the one that has the most variance. It's in the direction of the most variance of the data. You could see it's kind of along the longest. Let me use my mouse. So here we've got the most variance, it's most spread out. So our first principal component is in that direction. And then in PCA, we're orthogonal. So the second principal component is orthogonal to that, the third orthogonal also, and so forth and so on. Okay, so what this ends up looking like, if we want to kind of go back into the problem, is here we've got 85 magnitude components. Okay, so we've got 85 different magnitude frequencies to look at. And so we can take some of these and we can combine them into an RGB display. So that just has the 3 components, but we're not really effectively handling all of that information. And so what we end up with in an 85 dimensional space is we end up with 85 eigenvalues and 85 eigenvectors, right? So like the example I showed you, we were just in 2 dimensions, so we had two eigenvalues, 2 eigenvectors. And so when we look at, in this case, the first 3 eigenvalues here, you can see that they account for most of the variation. So the first eigenvector itself accounts for maybe 62% of the variation in our data. So what we're doing is we're taking 85 and we're going to be cutting it down to 3 or so. All right. And so, yes. And so those are the things I kind of wanted to mention as on this slide, is you can take just a couple of the eigenvalues in order to approximate most of the variation in your data. And that makes it easier to understand and to see. So we're not going to be working in 85 dimensional space, but rather in 3-dimensional space. And so when we look at those first 3 principal components, what we end up with is something like this. So we've got our first eigenvector, our second eigenvector, and then our third eigenvector component, PCA component. And so what you're able to see is that in the first one, we're able to capture a lot of the information. And even in the second and the third one, while those are capturing less of the variance, they're actually showing some kind of interesting anomalies that we may end up wanting to interpret. One way my students have used this before is, if you're searching for fizz gas, was one of the problems we were trying to solve, so undersaturated gas reservoirs, you can use not the main principal component, but you can use one of, you can search through some of the other ones in order to find more of the anomalous features. Because if you think about it, fizz gas may not be, most likely always not be the main component of your seismic data. And so what you're looking for is something more anomalous. So don't always discard some of these other eigenvectors, but consider looking through them to see what is more anomalous in your data set. So that's another way to use PCA. Okay, so to summarize really quickly, a little bit about PCA. I've hopefully kind of showed you that it's a great way to take many, many attributes, many, many dimensions of data and narrow it down into just a few. And I'll show more geologic examples later on in this lecture. You want to keep in mind that the principal components, they don't necessarily have a direct relationship to geology or physics. They're just mathematical constructs trying to represent most of the variance in the multidimensional seismic data that you fed it. But it's a really great way to kind of work with a smaller set of more orthogonal attributes, more orthogonal data as part of a larger data set. Okay, another method that we use for dimension reduction is independent component analysis, or ICA. And so one of the ways that my current postdoc likes to explain this is through the cocktail party problem. And so this is where you kind of have, you can imagine you have 2 people, myself and maybe Dr. Lubo, and we're both talking at a cocktail party, and you're trying to differentiate, okay, well, which signal is coming from which person? And so independent component analysis works similarly, where it's trying to statistically find independent components. So separate the, turbidite from the crevice splay. So separate those kind of components out that have different signal components to them. And this is done by maximizing the non-Gaussian behavior of the data. So to do this, you need to generate statistically independent components. And also, it doesn't work well with Gaussian if you have a Gaussian distribution. But it works really great in seismic data. And so thinking about PCA and ICA, there's a few differences between them, and I encourage you to try both of them if you have software that can handle both of them and compare and contrast. So PCA, remember, is kind of giving us orthogonal projections. So in this case, you can kind of see where we think PCA1 would lie with the most variance, and then PCA2, well, ICA doesn't have that orthogonality component. So sometimes it works a little bit better with real world relationships because it doesn't require those orthogonal components. And ICA also works better with non-Gaussian distributions. So just something else to keep in mind when you're trying them out. And so for the fun part, of course, like let's look at some seismic data. So here we're looking at a comparison of PCA versus ICA. So PCA on top, ICA on the bottom. And so in this case, ICA had some clear advantages. It did a better job delineating geologic features at different scales. It also shows a reduced acquisition footprint. So you could see the acquisition footprint up here in PCA, and it's not seen in ICA. So it got rid of it wasn't as sensitive to the acquisition footprint noise. It also gave us a better contrast between seismic facies, and you can kind of see that in here with some of the, meandering channel number 1, and even with some of the different facies within this distributary channel kind of running through here. So just something to consider. What we found using both of these methods quite often in class and in research is that every data set is different. Our goals for analysis are always different. There isn't one particular method that I would always recommend. Let's see, it's January 2025, and I'll go on record saying right now, I find that I like to run ICA first and PCA second, but I usually run both of them just for a comparison to see which one is letting me image the features I'm interested in. Here's another example. So looking at the same data set, a different time slice or a different horizon slice, looking at ICA and then doing some blending of different ICA components. So just like we do spectral decomposition and we blend 3 components RGB, you can do the same with ICA, which is pretty cool, or PCA. So you could take 3 of the eigenvectors or principal components that you're most interested in, and you could blend them and co-render them. And so this is just showing an example of that, which is pretty good for, in this case, for showing some differentiation between the on-axis and then kind of off-axis depositional patterns. We can even see some subtle changes in the variations of the lithologies of this very complex channel system. Before I had said ICA in the last slide wasn't showing the acquisition footprint well. In this case, the ICA components that we chose are highlighting a little bit more of the acquisition footprint. But overall, remember that the reason we use these tools is so that we can identify patterns as geologists and better interpret them. Okay, so just a quick summary. ICA gives us results that I find are typically more closely tied to actual geologic facies than PCA does, because it can handle those non-Gaussian distributions and it doesn't require let's see, you're getting the real life experience where I forget words. It doesn't require the orthogonality. It doesn't have that component required. And so anyway, those are some things to kind of keep in mind. It's also based on higher order statistics. So overall, I always try out ICA first, like I mentioned. Okay, so going into clustering, there's many different unsupervised clustering techniques. And so with unsupervised clustering, what you're doing is you're trying to cluster aspects of the seismic waveform or seismic attributes that are similar. So you're not giving it geologic meaning. You're just saying, okay, over here at this XYZ and this XYZ, the attributes and seismic amplitude that I was fed as a machine look similar. And then later on, you as the interpreter come in and you assign it meaning. Okay, so unsupervised clustering does not give anything geologic meaning, but rather you do as the interpreter. And this could work really well if you have a couple of well logs that you could tie to seismic and use to give more concrete meaning to the different colored clusters. Okay, so k-means is one of the most straightforward, simplest unsupervised clusters. What happens is that you start with some kind of initial seed points. And so here we've got the 2 attribute example again. The algorithm goes through and it tries to move those seed points to be near a cluster center. And so it does this very iteratively, and eventually it converges. So in this case, we had to identify ahead of time, we want 2 clusters. So that's one of the parameters that you'll give it as a geologist. so it could work for like sand shale or channel, not channel, salt, not salt. You may want to give it more clusters if you're expecting more seismic facies that you want to look at. And so this is done, the distance is calculated using the Mahalanobis distance, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. Okay, so what it looks like, here we've got 10 clusters. So of course, remember, we're not giving it meaning, we're just seeing the patterns. And you could see that it looks like a lot of the channels were put in the yellow or red cluster. It looks like there's a lot of green in the channels too. Blue seems to be right outside of the channels. So we would kind of have to go through, use our geologic knowledge, do our into-context interpretation. But it does give us a very nice pattern to work with. So in this case, we would use that well control to give it meaning. So here, the authors of the study, who of course looked at this for more than it took me to read the paper, they went through, and with their well control, they assigned the red clusters to be point bars and channel margins, maybe a sheet sand. The orange was more of the inner channel along axes. We've got very low hydrocarbon probability in the gray cluster. So that's what you would do as a geologist. Another method of unsupervised clustering that I'm going to show you next is self-organizing maps. And so I like this analogy for further explaining unsupervised clustering because it's easy to understand because we're talking about fruit. And so in this case, we have 3 attributes of the fruit. We have the vitamin C content, the aspect ratio. So is it a round fruit or like a long fruit, like a banana? And then the color of the skin, so the frequency of the skin. And so those are 3 attributes. And what the method would do, whether it's k-means or self-organizing maps, it would try to cluster. So it would try to make those 3, 4, 5, however many specified clusters to best represent it. And so in this case, we have a cluster of kind of redder, rounder fruit with high vitamin C content. We have a cluster of round blue, high vitamin C blueberries. We've got some melons, and then some outliers also. When we are showing our data in multidimensional space, this is kind of interesting. So we have all of our data vectors, and what we need to do is we need to deform our, kind of unravel our data manifold in a sense to make it fit our data in terms of displaying it in a color bar that we can understand. And so what we will do is we will take the data vectors and we will kind of try to fit them to this data manifold and then unravel it in latent space and apply a 1D color bar to it. And so that's what I'm trying to show here with the data and then the linear latent space and the pink line on the bottom, and then applying the 1D color bar where we can see the proximity of different data points that are close to each other. So over here, we've got A, so these values are very close to each other, so we would want them to be near each other on the color bar for us to see the patterns, and they all lie kind of in the bluer colors. Whereas, same thing down here, these are probably the light orange data vectors once we unravel the data manifold onto a 1D color bar in the latent space. So it's kind of, hopefully that helps you understand how that works. Okay, so self-organizing maps is a method that's been around for, I think we're getting close to 50 years or so. And what that does is it tries to go from a linear plane to a deformed manifold to fit the data. And so in this case, it can be used as both a data reduction technique, and some people call it a unsupervised classification technique also. There's a little more nuance in it than I'm able to get to in a quick little lecture. That's already hit 20 minutes and I still got 6 slides left. But so anyway, so what SOM does is it tries to deform the space, so kind of like I was just showing you in the last slide, to fit the data points better for clustering. And so I'm going to show you an example of how this works because I feel like showing geologic examples kind of motivates people to actually try it out with their own data that you're more familiar with. So in this case, we have a horizon slice through a seismic amplitude that we're going to look at. We've got some fun features here. This is the Waka 3D data set, which I love working with. But you've got some very complex channels in here. You've got some turbidites, some crevice splays. I can't remember if there's one in here. But this is some data from New Zealand. And so when we look at it in self-organizing maps, this would be our result. And in this case, we also applied a co-render with similarity just to kind of bring out some of the edges and enhance them a little bit more. And so you could see just between looking at the amplitude and the self-organizing maps results that we're seeing a lot more patterns that we're able to quickly identify. Okay, so that's for SOM. So the other one I want to talk about is generative topographic mapping. And this is one we've been using a lot in our research group too. And what this does is it goes a little bit further than self-organizing maps, and it tries to move beyond just fitting it as a plane, but rather move the manifold, try to deform it more, and then kind of hone in even tighter and tighter and tighter. Okay, and so what you eventually want to do is you want to get to the point where you can't maximize the fit anymore by with any more deformation. Okay, and so this would be the same result now with generative topographic mapping. So you know, it's another method that is very similar to SOM in terms of unsupervised clustering, and we've used it quite a bit in our seismic analyses for a whole bunch of different types of geologic facies and purposes. So even like basement fault mapping, we use GTM quite a bit for that. So it just gives you another perspective. It gives you another way to visualize the data. Again, as the interpreter, you have to go back in and say, hey, I'm going to identify this as that. So, you know, just keep that in mind. One of the problems with GTM that you want to keep in mind is that you can overfit the data. And we think that this happens, you know, every once in a while. So you kind of got to be careful about your parameterization when you run it. Okay, so just for a quick summary of these more popular unsupervised methods, I think SOM and GTM have quite an advantage over k-means because it keeps the similar classes next to each other in terms of the color scale, the 1D latent space color scale, which helps us as seismic interpreters. You know, k-means definitely is very useful, but just in terms of colorizing, it's, you know, I like SOM and GTM a little bit better. So let's see, anything else? Yeah, let's see what else I want to mention. So these can all be applied to as many seismic attributes as you want, as big as multi-dimensional space as you want. You know, with k-means, you have to specify how many clusters that you're going to end up with. So if you don't know how many clusters you're going to end up with, that might be another reason to go towards SOM or GTM to use them for classifying. And as always, these are just showing us data points in space that are similar to other ones. And then we as the geologists have to go in and give it meaning. And so just to kind of summarize this little mini lecture, and I'll get into unsupervised stuff in a later lecture, you want to, when you go in and you do this, you don't want to have too many dimensions. So some of the things that you want to do is avoid redundant attributes. So you don't want to, you know, necessarily put in 5 different types of coherence that you've calculated different ways. You may want to choose attributes that are geologically correlated to the features you're interested in. A lot of times we have a kind of our secret, not so secret sauce method of different attributes that we always start with. And we have attributes that kind of align with, you know, edge detecting attributes, so geometry attributes, frequency related attributes, amplitude related attributes, texture attributes. So we'll do a mix of those as kind of our starting point and see how well they work. So, you know, having different types of attributes can help you better differentiate your facies of interest. And of course, one of the things we've noticed and really have to focus on is, you know, like clustering will favor your dominant populations. So if you have something that's very anomalous, it may not show up in the clusters. It may show up on one of those later, you know, when I talked about dimension reductions, on one of those smaller eigenvectors that represent less of the variance. Ways to get around this is to make sure you crop your data. So if you're just interested in a specific area of interest, crop your data to that area of interest, and that may help you find those more anomalous zones a little bit easier. So as always, thank you for listening.